Hi, everyone. My name is Ellie, and I will be talking to you today about the different types of cell signaling. So, first of all, I just wanted to take a minute to define what cell signaling is. And so, it's basically exactly how it sounds. It involves the transfer of a signal from one cell to another. And this typically involves three stages. So you have reception, where a cell is detecting a signal molecule that comes from maybe another cell. Sometimes this signal can actually come from itself. We'll talk about that a little bit later. But there is a sending out of the signal, and this is received. Then there's transduction. So when the signal molecule binds to the receptor, it changes maybe the receptor protein in some way, which triggers a response from the target cell. And so this is kind of shown in the picture below, where you have a cell that's sending out a signal. We would call that a ligand. And that ligand is going to bind to a receptor on the target cell and trigger a response. In the non target cell, the is just illustrating the fact that this is a specific process. It requires high specificity binding in order to trigger specific responses. So these are the different types of cell signaling that we'll be covering today. So there's direct contact, there's paracrine, autocrine, and endocrine signaling. So we'll start today with direct contact. And direct contact is exactly how it sounds, where two cells are directly connecting to each other in order for these three steps of cell signaling to occur. And this can happen through what are called gap junctions. And gap junctions are basically water-filled channels in the cell that allow, on the surface of the cell, that allow intracellular mediators to diffuse between these two cells. And this allows for direct communication. And so these gap junctions can have proteins on their surfaces that complement each other on each of the cells. And so they bind via these complementary proteins. And then the signal can be transduced. And a good example of direct contact is with the immune system. So, in the immune system, we don't want our immune cells killing cells that we need that are good. And so we actually have, there are healthy cells have receptors on them that actually basically tell our immune system, hey, I'm, a good guy, so don't kill me. And so they can actually detect those receptors and direct contact and move on um, to another cell that needs to actually be destroyed. Oh, and in plant cells, these gap junctions are actually called plasmodesmata, and it essentially works in the same manner, but because you have to get through the cell wall, it's a little bit bigger of a process, and so that is called those gap junctions in plant cells, quote unquote, are called plasmodesmata. So our second signaling pathway is going to be paracrine signaling, and this is where we have communication through the release of chemical messengers, and this typically happens between short distances. And so basically you have a chemical signal sent out, and it travels to the nearby cell and allows that target cell to have a response. This can occur in development, which I will talk about in a minute. And then also a great example of paracrine signaling is in our synaptic nerve cells. And so basically, you have when a neuron fires, an electrical impulse is sent rapidly through the cell, traveling down the long fiber like extension, which is called an axon. And when the impulse reaches that synapse here in the middle, that triggers the release of these neurotransmitters. And the neurotransmitters are going to quickly cross that small gap, bind to the receiving cell, and then cause a chemical change inside of the cell. And this often is the response is basically opening ion channels and perpetuating that electrical potential across the membrane. Okay, so I wanted to talk a little bit about how we see paracrine signaling in development. And so when the fetus is developing, we have what is called the notochord. And the notochord is basically the location where all of our spinal cord is going to develop from. And the notochord and the floor plate, which basically just surrounds the notochord, as the embryo is developing, releases a signaling molecule. And this is actually called sonic hedgehog. Kind of a funny name. I'll talk about that in a minute. But this forms a gradient from a higher concentration to a lower concentration. So the higher concentration is going to be found close to the notochord, where that signal came from, and then it's going to just basically diffuse into lower concentrations as you get further away from the source of that signal. And this actually, the different concentrations determines the types of neurons that are going to be developed and come from that part of the spinal cord. And it's really quite complex. It's not totally fully understood, but it's pretty amazing how this happens. And signals like sonic hedgehog that form gradients like this and produce different developmental effects depending on the dose. So it's not just the signal, but it's the dose of signal that determines the specific response. These are called morphogens, and we see these in a lot of other pathways during development. So pretty amazing. The reason why it's called Sonic Hedgehog is kind of a funny story. It's from a video game, and the man who discovered this gene and this protein that produces this signal, his kids were playing a lot of this video game, and there were already other genes deemed hedgehog genes because of the way that they looked. And so he just kind of tacked onto that and called it the sonic hedgehog gene. Kind of funny. Okay, so our third pathway is going to be autocrine signaling, and this is basically when the cell signals itself to respond in a certain way. And so it releases a ligand that binds to the receptor on its surface and then causes a specific a specific response to be given. And this also we see important during development. It can help cells take on and reinforce their correct identities. And so what they do, they just are kind of stimulated to continue to do during development. And autocrine signaling is also really important in cancer, and it's actually thought to play a key role in metastasis, which is basically the spread of cancer from its original site to other parts of the body. And so in many cases, a signal may have both autocrine and paracrine effects that basically help to transduce and proliferate and continue to have the same function in, larger areas of the body. All right. And lastly, we're going to cover endocrine signaling. Endocrine signaling is, we're getting longer and longer, so it's our longest distance signaling. And it basically signals the production of hormones. And so Signals are produced by very specialized cells in one part of the body. They travel through the bloodstream to reach these targets called hormones, and then those hormones trigger a certain response. So there are many endocrine glands in the body, and those are the thyroid, hypothalamus, pituitary gland, gonads, and pancreas. And all of these are really, really important in our cells and our bodies being able to do what they do. And so, one example is the pituitary gland when it releases growth hormone. Growth hormone is really important during development, it's important throughout our um, life as we continue to develop and grow and get bigger. It promotes growth, particularly in skeletal muscle and cartilage. And so, like most hormones, growth hormone is actually going to affect not just one type of cell, but many type of cells throughout the body. And yeah, so it binds to receptors on the surface of cells and then encourages them to continue to divide and proliferate so that we can continue to grow. Another example would be in the pancreas. The pancreas gets signaled to produce or release insulin. And this happens from a triggering response of high glucose in the blood. And so, when we have high glucose in the blood, our body is going to increase the amount of insulin that gets released from the pancreas in order to encourage that uptake of glucose into many different cells. And again, this happens, endocrine signaling has to occur through the bloodstream and can occur through long distances throughout the body. And these are my references. Thank you so much. I hope you guys have a great rest of your day.